Whoops, ran into some technical difficulties there. Let me pick up where I left off. I was sharing my lecture notes with you to talk about this example um, that's done in the old time style, but is recalling a traditional construct, and that is the hornpipe. So as you recall, the hornpipe is an old folk dance that was popular in Ireland and England in the 16th century, and generally was a slower tempo and had a kind of lilting rhythm to it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the fiddlers, especially in the American style, were really prone to turning everything into a fast tune. So this hornpipe definitely falls into a much more real like realization. Let me go ahead and pull it up for us. The instrumentation here, as you can see, is a fiddle, a guitar, an upright bass, and a mandolin. And this hornpipe, like I said, in an older setting would have been a much slower tempo, but done in this old time style is significantly more upbeat. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about bluegrass. And bluegrass is a style of folk music that emerged around the 30s. In bluegrass, individual members, like you saw here, the fiddle, banjo, and or mandolin, end up taking turns improvising on a given tune. And then the other members, typically like a guitar or an upright bass, support the soloist. So this is our tried and true definition of homophonic texture. The old time and bluegrass collectively came to be first known as hillbilly music, but later kind of as country music. Bluegrass really became popular nationally, for this matter, in the 1940s. And there were tons of recordings of it that were broadcast on the radio, and lots used for low budget kind of cowboy movies at that point. We're going to take a listen to a performance of a tune called Sally Goodwin that is done in a bluegrass style. So let me go ahead and pull that up.
Pie, little piece pudding, I'm going down the road to sing Sally Goodwin. Hey, little piece pie, little piece pudding, I'm going down the road to sing Sally Goodwin.
I would say that we're a combination of things, old time music.
So it's just a little sample of the bluegrass style, something I could certainly spend a ton more time with, but its roots are really within the tradition of, or partially within the tradition of the music of Irish immigrants. So as you can kind of tell, this isn't a huge far cry from some of the more traditional reels that we heard, certainly in terms of that kind of constantly churning rhythmic activity, to the style of fiddle playing. There's a lot of things that are ripe for comparison, most certainly. So let me go ahead and pull back my lecture notes. I want to talk just briefly about American folk dance music. And like we discovered with talking about traditional Irish music, there's a close relationship with music and dance. Early country music and step dancing has been really beneficial to the preservation and the transmission of both art forms. So American dance forms really took styles and dance steps from different sources, much like we heard for the old time style music and the bluegrass tradition. So Irish in American folk dance, we really have an interesting blend of Irish and Scottish reels and jigs mixed along with folk dancing of American blacks, as well as Cherokee step dances. So the American forms of step dancing are really known under the umbrella term of clogging. So for those of you who are like, I'm not really sure what you're talking about right now, hopefully clogging rings a bell. And if you think about clogging, clogging also has a lot of similarities to Irish dance, where we're keeping the upper body very stiff and the lower body is much more movement oriented. So clogging ends up including Appalachian buck dancing and flat footing. American step dancing also has roots in Juba dance and African American buck dancing. So in addition, we also have Irish set dancing to contend with, which is the example I do want to talk about. It ends up being transformed into the basis of square dancing. And like I said, clogging, which is usually accompanied by old time music and bluegrass. So let me go ahead and pull up an example of some Irish set dancing. Hopefully you can see that there's a number of similarities here to some of the other dance examples that we saw. Really, really interesting tradition of dance and music happening alongside one another. I don't want to keep us too long on this subject. We have a number of other things that we need to discuss, particularly as we head into the 19th century. So let me go ahead and pull my lecture notes back up. In talking about immigration into the US in the 19th century, we're really starting our discussion in 1820 to 1860, when nearly 2 million Irish arrived in the United States and Canada, mostly to escape the Great Famine that happened in 1845 that lasted until 1852. Really, really awful. Lots of people making their ways through what we called coffin ships, where people were often not surviving the trip over. For those who did end up surviving, they ended up settling for the most part in large cities where they could create their own kind of communities for support and protection. As we have already heard, there was a number of anti-immigration things afoot, especially it would come to be part of the law in the later 20s. So meanwhile, in and around this atmosphere, New York City was really the spot of American musical comedy. We have a diversity of styles that are popping up in New York at that particular point. Your reading deals with Irish music in New York specifically. So I'm not going to labor on that for too long, but there's a very interesting intersection that happens there in regards to the theater and music and dance all together, kind of pushing us into the 20th century. The 20th century had a really radical effect on traditional Irish music. One of these influences that we've already seen and talked about is the rise of recording technology, right? So the commodification of Irish music and eventually dance ends up being a possibility in the 20th century. Recordings made in the early 20th century by Irish immigrants circulated by the thousands throughout the US and Ireland. Radio broadcasts made available music that had not been available to the masses before, and dance music became listening music. And amateur music making was set up in private settings, in the 20th century. So we have some important factors that are going to shape the changes that happen in Irish music. So in 1922, Ireland achieved independence, just as jazz was becoming the most popular music in the US and spreading internationally. So Ireland's newly empowered Catholic Church, really backed by a conservative government, ended up condemning jazz and jazz dancing. Honestly, by 1937, all dancing was effectively banned except in approved venues, which is pretty strict. So in that case, there were different bands in Ireland specifically that were more traditionally oriented. Ones that included the fiddle, the whistle, the flute, the accordion, and the newest member, a piano, sort of to kind of influence the rhythm of what we were listening to. So let me give you an example of what that music style sounded like. Hold, please. Wonderful. Really fun, again, combination of dance and music together. Um, kind of, again, thinking about what was happening in the 50s and 60s, there was a rebirth of the traditional music and ballads that was happening. Part of this was because of the political moves that I just spoke about in Ireland. But there were sort of three movements taking place in the 50s and 60s. One of them was the establishment of the organizations to promote and support traditional Irish music. The other was the formation of instrumental ensembles. And lastly, there was the influence of folk revivals in the US and Ireland. By the late 1960s, the sessions had come an established custom, and that's really vital to the Irish musical community and life today. Um, so speaking about this folk music revival that began in the 1960s, there were singers and songwriters such as Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan that really crafted and sang ballads. Remember, we talked about ballads and protest songs in beatnik joints and coffee houses in downtown New York. Um, so we have this, interest in folk music, especially meditated by these urban singers, as being cool for the youth, urban based, but also a part of the counterculture. So inspired by the folk music revival in America, a parallel folk music phenomenon really swept through Ireland and England. And it made it cool for young people to enjoy music that was previously considered kind of contradictory. The new styles of ballads and singing was really very wildly popular. Irish musicians added instruments of American folk music like the guitar, the banjo, and the mandolin to traditional folk groups. We've already seen this in the bluegrass style, but now it was being reconsidered in a more traditional context. So these groups didn't often engaged in the active practice with the association of what's called a session. So a session is a group of instrumentalists who play traditional Irish music, and it's typically in a pub or a bar. It's music, however, that's meant to be a listening experience and not one that's for dance. So I'd love to play you a session at O'Neill's Bar, which is in New York City, as an example of this movement. as you can tell, our setting is informal. It's at a bar. Our focus is really driven to the music. Oh, there we go. And it's again in the style that we covered in our second section. These sound very similar to reels, in fact. So let me pull up my lecture notes. Again, I have just a little bit more time to talk about current trends that are happening. I wanted to pull through just 2 examples, which doesn't do this last section enough justice. However, there are a number of things that happened in the 20th century where we have Irish music that starts to intersect with other genres of music, such as rock and roll, punk, hip hop, and rap. I wish I could play an example of each, but I want to just hone in on 2 that are somewhat obvious examples. The first is an example of Celtic rock, which does have some crossover instrumentation from our typical ensembles that we've seen. I want to start off by having us listen to the original version of the tune, which is a hornpipe, and then play the group called Horselips, their rendition in a rock style. So let me go ahead and pull that up. So in this case, this is much more of the traditional hornpipe that we're used to hearing, that kind of lilting manner that's much slower and more subdued than the reels are. Let me go ahead and pull up the Horselips rendition of that same tune. Instead of the fiddle always getting a solo, we have a chance for our traditional electric guitar solo. There are so many interesting crossovers that happen in the genre of rock alone. I want to turn our attention very briefly to punk rock and talk about there are two groups that sort of immediately come to mind the Dropkick Murphys. It's an Irish-American punk rock band, interestingly enough, from Massachusetts. Also a group called the Dubliners. But they often had a mix of original songs and traditional Irish songs that were played in a particularly loud, aggressive style that's commonly associated with punk rock. Let me close out our lecture today playing a little bit of the Dropkick Murphys song, Rocky Road to Dublin.
So weary start a whiny light next morning, cried an early kick to drop it up the order, keep me hot from sinking, that's the petty's cure. Riding down the drink and see the lasses fall, laughing all the while, and me down the star and sit short above the house. There was a high, the wind is I was gone, and I was almost down over the rocky road to Dublin. Up the hill and put it down the rocky road and all the way to Dublin, whack the lorry door. And Dublin next to Lila, for the sun should be the piece of soon to buy the blue. Decided to take me so long, because the London was so the because my mind, when I look behind, I'm like a ball. On the stick of woman crying for. Up the rocky road to Dublin. Up the hill and turn down the rocky road and all the way to Dublin and whack the lorry door. From there I got away, my spirits never fell and landed on the cage as the ship was sailing. Captain at me road said that no room had it, then I jumped aboard a cabin far from Penny down among the bridge, paid some funny rings, that's some honey drinks, the water around me bubbling up the horny head, wish my soul was dead, a bit of fire instead, on the rocky road to Dublin. Up the hill and turn down the rocky road and all the way to Dublin, rock the lorry door.
Amazing. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and conclude our final segment of today's lecture on Irish music. Again, Irish traditional music has had an interesting influence on a number of current genres past rock or even punk rock into the hip hop and rap scenes. We also saw its obvious influence on bluegrass and old time music as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. I will see you next time for our next installment. Bye for now.